Will the Committee of Supply please come to order? This section of the Committee of Supply will now resume consideration of the estimates for the Department of Consumer Protection and Government Services. Question for this department will continue in a global manner. The floor is now open for questions. The Honourable Member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and nice to be back again. And yesterday, when we left off, I was just wondering what are the numbers and the type of people bidding for their birth certificate or marriage certificate, or what are those numbers?
The Honourable Minister.
I thank the member, and I recall, I think when I first took on this role, chatting with the member, and when we were congratulating each other on our respective roles as the new minister and the new critic for Consumer Protection and Government Services, we had a chat back then, and at that time, I think the member was likely aware because he's talking to the same citizens that I'm talking to, that the wait times were significant. I think at the end of January, by my records here, it was about a 5-month backlog for birth certificates, for the registration of a birth certificate, and then a couple more days or weeks for the processing of the actual certificate, depending if brush service was chosen. So it was at the beginning of this year, as I took on the role, about 5 months. We've been working very hard on that backlog, as the member knows, and we've been adding staff. So the latest information I have, which is less than a week old, is showing that we're just around the 2 to 2.5 month mark. So we've managed to cut the backlog more than in half in just the last, I guess that's 4 months.
The Honourable Member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And actually, I was looking at the numbers. If the minister can provide us the numbers, how many people, what is the backlog with the numbers? Hundreds, thousands?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you. Yes, and I think I was mentioning yesterday that I hesitate to spell it out in those terms because the nature of the work is that there's just an incredible volume that has to go through the Vital Statistics Office on an annual basis. I believe the number was 125,000 events are typically going through the system, and so that's a few thousand, a couple thousand every week. So even if we had the wait times down to say 3 weeks, you would still have a backlog with 6,000 in it. So I don't have a specific backlog number to share with the member, but I'm very optimistic that we've made north of a 50% improvement. I've made it clear to my staff that that's appreciated, but also not our final target. we're committed to completely eliminating that backlog and getting our service times, better than our targeted amounts.
The honorable member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, this is so disappointing. Like, Minister have the number like a month, but he doesn't have the numbers. Can he maybe undertake to providing us these numbers by probably in a week or so? Because when we have we know there's a wait list, 2.5 months to 3 months, but the numbers should be there too. Like,
The honorable minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start by just correcting the member. It's currently under 2.5 months. It's closer to 2 months backlog. So as I said, a significant improvement, less than half the size that it was just a few short months ago. I appreciate the member's desire to get a number on that backlog. So I do agree that I will take that. My department will take that as an undertaking, and we'll endeavor to provide those numbers and some context around it to help ensure that there's realistic expectations on the part of the member and on the part of the public as they see those numbers. So yeah, appreciate the inquiry, and yes, I will take it as an undertaking.
The honorable member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the minister and the staff for providing those numbers later on. When people don't get their event certificate on time, what is the effect on Manitobans? So can minister maybe just, if they don't get their birth certificate on time, or if they don't get their death certificate on time, or even if they don't get their marriage certificate on time, what is the effect on Manitobans?
The Honorable Minister.
I thank the member, and I hope the member can appreciate a couple things. One is that those impacts aren't necessarily something that's in my departmental purview, and as such, he has probably as much insight as I would or any other MLA would as to how this is impacting our constituents. But the member and I have both chatted about some of the impacts, so I think we're both reasonably familiar. You know, an example would be a delay in the registration of birth can result in a delay in the payment of child tax benefits. Usually those payments are made retroactively, and so it does catch up. But that payment can really be impactful to families, and that's, you know, one of the reasons that I've really prioritized the birth registration backlog as something that needs to be addressed thoroughly. Other impacts the member would know, right? We've spoken with individuals who are under a time constraint to get a passport. And in those cases, I think the member would agree, and I believe I mentioned yesterday, the department does make every effort when a member comes to an MLA's office to say, look, this is my circumstance, and they're vetted there, and the MLA agrees that they have a reasonable request to get their certificate faster than most other Manitobans. That when those escalations are sent into my office, they are dealt with, you know, quite promptly and effectively, and I think that reality does help to mitigate and minimize the impacts of these delays. But I don't want to pretend that they're not impactful. The member knows that I know that they are, and the member knows that they are, and the constituents that we have to deal with regularly know, and I know the other MLAs in my caucus and his caucus and among the Liberals also have helped. You know, have had contact with people in these situations where the delays are impacting them, and you know, some we've been able to assist, but with others, it is sometimes just a matter of patience to ensure that you know, say the birth is registered so the child tax benefits flow. Yeah, we ask for patience on that, but as I indicated, you know, we've managed to cut our backlog on birth registrations by nearly, or actually by more than 2.5 months in the 3.5 months since I've been in the role as minister. I'm optimistic we'll be able to continue to reduce that backlog at a significant pace over the coming few months, and have a much better situation by the time we get into the summer and fall.
The Honorable Member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Last season, my colleague, the MLA for Kawitnook, pushed for a change regarding name registration to allow for traditional indigenous character and name to be registered. Unfortunately, the PC government didn't support my colleague bill, but later amended the Vital Stats Act to make this change. Does the minister have any stats on the number of names that have been registered using the newly allowed character and the names?
The Honorable Minister.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question, Mr. Chair. I think the member will agree that it was important to do that work that was brought forward by my predecessor under Bill 3. And I think the number of that bill should indicate the relative priority that it was to our government. That it was very important to ensure that it got addressed early in the session. And I'm recalling that it did receive unanimous support from all parties, and I was very happy about that. That we could move forward in that way. Before I get into the number, I want to spell out, I think, for the member, just to ensure he's aware that while Manitoba and some other provinces are doing well in this regard, and ensuring that these special characters for Indigenous names and even some other cultures, Scandinavian comes to mind, that these characters can be used, there's still a gap, and that gap is that at a federal level, federal documents don't support some of these special characters. So, for example, you can't get a passport with these characters on it, and that's formed a barrier. So, some families that might have wanted to include these characters in their child's name, when they find out that they can't get a passport with that in it, and that might create issues for travel for that child for some time potentially. Some of them decide not to proceed at this time, and so I think the numbers are perhaps lower than we might think that they could be or would be. And I think they are lower than they would be if the federal government had been catching up. So the latest number I have is kind of stale. It says of February the 1st. And as of February the 1st, there were 11 such instances that had been registered at Vital Statistics.
The Honorable Member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Minister too. And we will be moving to RTV now, and want to know what is the current vacancy rate is at RTV.
The Honorable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll note with some amusement that the question is a little ambiguous, because when you talk about vacancies and the Residential Tenancies Board, usually we're thinking about how many apartments might be available, in the city or in the province. But I'm pretty confident that the member instead was referring to the number of full-time equivalents and the number of staff in the divisions. So there's 57 full-time equivalents in the budget. Right now, there are 4 vacancies, which results in a 7% vacancy rate.
The Honorable Member for the Maples.
How many above guideline increase requests did the RTV received in 2022-23?
The Honorable Minister.
I thank the member for the question. Residential Tenancies Board actually tracks those numbers on a calendar year basis, so I don't have the fiscal year breakdown for him. But I can say in the calendar year of 2022, so that's January 1st to December 31st of 2022, there were 353 above guideline rent increases that were received by the Residential Tenancies Board.
The Honorable Member for the Maples.
How many of them were approved?
The Honorable Minister.
I thank the member. Yeah, just for the purposes of clarity, it probably would be wise to talk through the process to ensure that that everything's understood. So when when an above guideline rent increase is made, there's three, I would say, possible outcomes. So one outcome is that there's no basis for the above guideline rent increase, in which case the application was made almost in error or by an effort of the landlord that was very misguided. That's rare, but last year there was about 10 of those, and so those ones result in the application being withdrawn. Then the other two outcomes that can occur is that the rent increase is approved exactly as provided by the landlord. So the landlord said, look, these and these and these are my expenses, and this and this and this is why I want this increase, and the Residential Tenancies Board approves it. And then the third thing is that the application is made for the above guideline rent increase, and parts of that application are denied by the Residential Tenancies Board. Well, they'll say, no, the amount of the increase that you're applying for is too high, and so they'll instead grant a lower above guideline rent increase instead.
The Honorable Member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So 353 above guideline applications were made, 10 were withdrawn, so that leaves with 343. So all 343 were approved with maybe what they were asking for, or then like what those numbers are. So like
The Honorable Minister.
Yeah, I don't have the breakdown of how many were approved as for the amount that they applied and how many are approved for a lower rate. But I do know that that's not uncommon for there to be approvals made, but for a lower amount.
The Honorable Member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So 353 applied, 10 withdrawn, 343 approved, so that's 100% approved. And how many Manitobans were affected by this rent increase?
The Honorable Minister.
I thank the member. I don't have the number directly related to the 343 applications that were approved or approved for a lower rate from last year, but I do have kind of an overview of what happens, because this is not above guideline rent increases, as the member would know from question period, is not a new process. It's not even a process that was changed at all by our government. It's a process that was set in place, I believe, by an NDP government back in the day, and even administered by someone who's sitting as a current NDP MLA, the member for Fort Garry. Fort Garry. The member for Fort Garry was in charge of approving a large number of these types of approvals. So, on average, over a 13-year period, there's about 346 applications made per year. And this year, we're talking about 353. So that's right on average. On average, there's 10 applications withdrawn. And last year, there were 10 applications withdrawn. On average, the percentage rate approval is below the actual, the percentage rate applied for is higher than the actual percentage rate granted by roughly the same percentage, about 2.5% or 3% reduction. And on average, between 20 and 25,000 units are impacted by above guideline rent increases each year.
The Honorable Member for the Maples.
So if ministers, so they were around between 20 to 25,000 units that were affected this year.
The Honorable Minister.
That's right.
The Honorable Member for the Maples.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. So what was the highest approved increase was this year?
The Honorable Minister.
Yeah, I thank the member for the question. I don't have that, that level of detail. We have averages, and I think the member might be already familiar with those averages. But what I will point out is that, you know, rent controls in Manitoba, generally speaking, roll forward at a calculated or prescribed rate. There's a formula for it. And our government interrupted that formula for 2022 and 2023 by setting the rent increase guideline to 0%. I think that's unprecedented in the history of our province to have two 0% increases in a year. I think the member knows why we're doing that, and certainly that's I think something that's going to contribute to, or that has contributed to, better results for tenants, and an ability for tenants to have some cost certainty as we went through the pandemic.
The Honorable Member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, my question was what was the highest approved increase above guideline?
The Honorable Minister.
Yes, and I began with my answer saying I don't have that number.
The Honorable Member for the Maples.
Can Minister undertake to providing these numbers?
The Honorable Minister.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. I think the member might be looking for some kind of a sensational number or something along those lines, but I would hesitate. I would recommend that, you know, from a policy crafting perspective, it's more important to look at the averages, and to see what you know, what the holistic plan is, because when you get to the fringe of any data set, maybe the member has studied maths in university like I have, you know, there's always going to be an outlier of some sort. And I can imagine, you know, I think of some apartment buildings in my community that were sorely run down and poorly maintained, and you could barely convince somebody to live there for $600 a month, and then a new owner came along and invested tens of thousands of dollars in each unit. I'm sure a significant increase to the rent was had there. As a percentage-wise, it's probably quite a significant number, but it's also not particularly relevant, because at the end of the day, these apartments were turned into something that, like just a much better unit in which people would want to live. So it's more important, I think, to look at the overall market, to look in terms of affordability, in terms of the rent assist programs that you can ask the Minister of Family about, and the ways that we try to ensure that that tenants are treated fairly in our province, and that landlords are also encouraged to make investments to improve the quality of their properties and improve the security of the tenants in their properties, and create you know, better outcomes for all Manitobans.
The Honorable Member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister said it's better to look at the average. So maybe can the minister provide the average above guideline that was last year?
The Honorable Minister.
Yeah, the average approved above guideline rate was 9.8%. The average approved above guideline rate over the last 13 years was 9.9%. So last year's average was slightly lower than the average over the last 13 years. No, I said, do you want to make it higher? That's
The Honorable Member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I also want to find out those AGIs, were the increases were concentrated in certain areas, or were they just all over the city, all over Manitoba, or were like most of the application out of 353 were they in downtown, like say south side? You got those numbers?
The Honorable Minister.
Yeah, thank the member for the question. Not really sure where he's going on that, but that information is generally not made public. Individual landlords have their relationships with their tenants, and they're often private buildings, and they're allowed to operate them in a way that complies with the legislation, and beyond that, it's not something that's posted on a public website. But I mean, we're talking about averages, and I know the member for Concordia, tried to get some words on the record, but he wasn't recognized by the chair, so I'll put them on the record for him. He said, when I said that 9.8% was how much it was increased by last year, but the average over the 13-year period that's before me, or that I have records for, was higher than that. He said we should do something about that. That's why I replied with the phrase, "Are you suggesting that we increase them more?" He thought that was funny, and he still seems to think that's funny. I'll tell you. I will tell you that when the member for Fort Garry was on the Residential Tenancies Commission, I think it was, making decisions about above guideline rent increases. The year before we came in government, when the member for Concordia was part of a very different looking NDP caucus than they have in the House today. I know the member never did get to sit in cabinet. The member never did get to sit in cabinet. I doubt he ever will, based on his current conduct, if not his past. But nonetheless, when he was in the government side of the House back in 2015, I think his seat might have been on the opposition side. Then the member for Fort Garry was on the Residential Tenancies Commission, and the member for Fort Garry was processing above guideline rent increases. So in 2015, the above guideline rent increases approved by the member for Fort Garry and whoever else was helping him on the Residential Tenancies Commission was a whopping 12%. In the year 2015, the average above guideline rent increase under the previous NDP government was 12%. That is 2.2% higher than it was last year under our government, even in the context of construction inflation and all sorts of other inflationary pressures that would suggest that those kinds of renovations may in fact be eligible for higher than the average guidelines. In fact, the end result was a lower than the historical average above guideline rent increase, and an improvement. I know this frustrates the member for Concordia. I know that he can't. He's hoping one day that he gets to sit around a cabinet table. He's frustrated he didn't have the opportunity to do that when he was on the government side of caucus for years and years. I don't have any expectation that he'll ever get to sit there. But I can tell you that what it takes to sit there is a level of discipline that he seems incapable of exercising.
Before I continue on, I'd like to remind the members that the person has the floor. And I'd like to stay on topic to what we're discussing today here. We are doing quite well, and we're hoping to finish these estimates off today. But please, let's have some respect for each other. Whoever has the floor has the floor. The honorable member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We know these above guideline rent increase, which is like 9.8%, is kind of high. So a member from Concordia was saying like we have to do something. Our member today, member from St. James, brought a very good bill this morning, and Minister just spoke about buying cars instead of talking about rent increases, how we can help those Manitobans. And so from there, Minister what that same thing here, and so Minister could have this morning supported our bill, and where this had probably helped lots of Manitobans. So maybe we can just move to the next question from here. So what was the average amount of time it took the residential tenancy branch to resolve dispute between tenant and the landlord?
The honorable minister.
I thank the member for that question. There's different types of disputes, I guess, and there's a fair bit of variability between the kinds of disputes that can happen between a tenant and a landlord. And so in total, there's about 3,700 of those claims being made on an annual basis. The wait times for hearing would vary from a few weeks to a few months. And then once the hearing has occurred, then those decisions are typically made in a few days to maybe a maximum of 2 weeks.
The honorable member for the Maples.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. And can you please break down those disputes and the wait time?
The honorable minister.
Sure. The highest priority disputes are emergency orders of possession. So an emergency order of possession, there's also a bill before the House that's related to that, but I'll stay focused here on estimates. So emergency order of possession are only in a matter of a few days that they're heard and dealt with. Other orders of possession are generally given priority, so those are about 3 weeks typically, and that's for non-payment of rent or for any other issue really that would result in a request for an eviction that's not of an emergent nature. So those are usually about 3 weeks. For other, disputes between the tenant and the landlord where the tenant relationship is still allowed to continue and there's no eviction, those ones tend to be more on the order of a few months.
The honorable member for the Maples.
Thank you for that, Mr. And also, yesterday we were talking about P3s. I have one question going back, which I referred that I'll ask later on. So we were just wondering, other than schools, is there any other P3 model that government is considering using in other departments?
Would you like me to put that on the record? I could credit you specifically. And then you could cut the page out from Hansard. And then you could cut the page out from Hansard. Whatever you want.
The honorable minister.
I thank the member. I hope that he can respect the fact that I'm not in charge of building absolutely everything that our government builds. I don't build the hospitals. That's for the health department. I don't build the highways. That's for transportation and infrastructure. I do build schools and a few other things. A lot of maintenance, even on this beautiful building here, that is done. So what I would say, I guess, in response to that question is at this time, there are no other areas that, in my purview, that I'm aware of that would be considered for P3.
The honorable member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to move on to right to repair now. Does the minister think it is important that Manitobans have the ability to repair the product they buy, including electronics, farm equipment, and more?
The honorable minister.
Yeah, I appreciate the member and the member's question, and he knows that I'm almost happy to talk about any topic at almost any time. And if he wants to catch me in the hallway, we can chat about everything from a great restaurant to eat at to what political policies on an international scale might need to be or should be. But in this case, my department does not have that within its purview. We're here to talk about the estimates of expenditure for the fiscal year ending 2024, March 31st. I don't think there's any reference to right to repair there.
The honorable member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are talking about consumer protection now, so that was the question. And maybe I can, if he doesn't know this one, maybe I can ask. Can the minister tell us what action he's taking to ensure Manitobans are able to repair the product they buy?
The Honorable Minister.
Yeah, I thank the member. I think my feedback on the first question was somehow not taken to heart by the member. What I would say is that the legislation that's before the House that's put forward by one of his members isn't what we're talking about here. The policy decisions of the government outside of the realm of what's been decided as part of the estimates isn't really in scope here. I'll just observe on the right to repair. I think, and again, this is just what I'm aware of, and I'm sure the member for Elm would be happy to tell you more about it. He seems to love this sort of thing. There's been some movement in the European Union towards improving right to repair legislation there too. I just asked that member, are there any provincial level? I mean, that's a multinational organization, the European Union. Would there be any provincial level or something that's below the size of a nation that he's aware of that has specific laws around right to repair that might help me understand what he's asking about?
The Honorable Member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is the minister thinking of introducing any legislation that will protect the consumer regarding when they buy a new product, buying their new vehicle, where they can get repair done wherever they want it?
The Honorable Minister.
Thank you. I'll once again remind the member that we're not talking here about potential legislative agendas or anything like that. We're talking about the way that our Consumer Department works right now. Consumer Protection Office works right now. What I will say is that the Consumer Protection Office answers roughly 15,000 inquiries annually, and that includes emails, phone calls. They also issue over 5,000 licenses to direct sellers, hearing aid dealers, collectors, collection agents, etc. And they've also investigated hundreds. I think last year was 427 consumer complaints. I'll also let the member know that Manitoba is one of the few provinces where the seller is liable for all warranties that they sell. That means if something does need to be shipped away to be repaired, then the seller is responsible for those costs. That's the way that Manitoban consumers are protected, perhaps better than in some other provinces. And there's also some even more specific requirements related to motor vehicle repairs that offer protection for consumers. So Manitoba does well, and the department certainly is handling a high volume of inquiries and consumer complaints and serving our province well.
The Honorable Member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to move on to Public Utility Board. How many times did the PUB met in 2022, 23?
The Honorable Minister.
Thank the member for the question about the Public Utilities Board. I don't have the specific answer to the question he's asking about how many times they've met. They're independent. And I make it my goal to keep them that way. I'll note that our government in this budget has increased the amount of funding to the Public Utility Board by $2 million to ensure that they are able to be a world-class regulator. That's what we want them to be, and that's what they're doing right now. Now, I will say for the member's benefit, because if he's perhaps thinking that they're not meeting, I can assure him that they are. They, for example, have had to meet and have hearings about the Manitoba Hydro electric general rate application. Also about the Manitoba Public Insurance Directive and General Rate application. They have to review Manitoba's efficiency plan. They will be expected to review, and they can review regularly Central Gas's general rate application. And they also have a tremendous amount of responsibility around municipal water and waste utilities. They actually have to deal with 240 individual municipal water and wastewater utilities across the province and deal with them from a rate setting perspective. So lots of work going on at the Public Utilities Board. Certainly, in addition to providing them with an extra $2 million in the 2023 budget. I have met once with the chair and assured him of my commitment to his continued independence and my support for his efforts to ensure that Manitoba has a world-class public utilities regulator, and that $2 million commitment certainly went a long way to assuring him of my commitment.
The Honorable Member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How does the passage of Bill 35 impact the pub?
The Honorable Minister.
Yeah, I thank the member for the question. I think the member would know that Bill 35 is not a consumer protection government services bill. It's a finance bill, because finance is responsible for hydro. I understand, I can appreciate, and I know the member for St. James has given me the eye here to say yes, but it does impact the PUB, and it does in fact impact the PUB. But in terms of the exact nature of that impact, I try to keep myself at arm's length from the Public Utilities Board, and I expect that they'll do that. I'll just read actually a few excerpts if the members will permit me from, I think this might be the most recent news release. I haven't checked, but one of the more recent news releases coming out of the Public Utilities Board. And this is what they have to say. They say the board, the Public Utilities Board specifically, is an impartial tribunal and regulator at arm's length from government. I'm going to emphasize and read that again, at arm's length from government, that acts in the public interest. That's certainly their mandate. That's really what I wanted to support them in doing. But the exact and particular nature of the work that they do and the legislation that might govern them, I haven't put myself into the weeds on that. I have ultimate confidence in the head of the Public Utilities Board to be able to do his work in accordance with the legislation that applies. But I'll also say from this news release, since I suspect it would not be the kind of a news release that might be mentioned by the members opposite in the House, is that the result of this particular decision that they made on Centra Gas is that it will decrease the typical residential customer bill, the annual bill, by 9.5%, a 9.5% decrease in natural gas rates at a time when almost everything else and every other grocery item and the cost of gasoline and the carbon tax supported by your NDP Liberal Coalition in Ottawa, all those things are going up. But here in Manitoba, we have the cost of natural gas decreasing as approved by the independent arm's length tribunal and regulator, the Public Utilities Board, decreasing at a rate of 9.5%.
The Honorable Member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do like to ask a question on MAHCP that they are they got strong mandate from the members to go on a strike. Is there a bargaining mandate regarding contract negotiation with the MAHCP from the minister?
Good question.
The Honorable Minister.
I thank the member for that question. I think he's in the wrong section estimates. This is Consumer Protection and Government Services, not anything to do with the Health Department, not anything to do with the work of the Public Sector Compensation Committee, but he might be close. If we get to my next department, I probably could provide him an answer, but a different set of deputies and staff will be beside me at that time. I do just want to revert back to the impact that Bill 35 would have on the Public Utilities Board. And I think one impact that I am aware of that I think is very significant is that major projects, capital projects, things like Bipole 3, things like the Kiosk hydroelectric dam generating station, these projects previously were not subject to the Public Utilities Board review. But what Bill 35 does is it ensures that the Public Utilities Board, this independent tribunal, this arm's length body that is independent from government and isn't subject to their say-so, would have something to say, would be given material and the opportunity to investigate that material and to comment on the decision making by government and the proposals being made by Manitoba Hydro to spend ratepayer and sometimes taxpayers' dollars on major capital projects like Bipole 3, like Kiosk. I hope the member recognizes that those kinds of investments significantly can impact the future of our province. Right now, roughly $1 billion a year is falling out of our province's economy, being paid by Manitoba Hydro in interest costs because of the significant debt incurred as part of Bipole 3 and as part of Kiosk. Those investments were made, without any scrutiny, without any independent oversight, without any input from the Public Utilities Board. That's not the way those decisions should be made, and I hope the members will agree with me that change that came in as part of Bill 35 is going to make things better in our province. It's going to prevent the kind of mistakes that the previous NDP government made.
The Honorable MLA for Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think Minister doesn't have anything good to say about the last 7 years. You have to go back, way back, and I don't know where Minister is going. Actually, I'm gonna go to my next question. On the page estimate book, page 24 and 25, the government is thinking of reducing owned and leased building footprint. Is the government considering selling off any public housing unit? Or
The Honorable Minister.
I thank the member and I thank him for his patience. I think first we should make sure we're on the same page in terms of what kind of buildings we're talking about here. So I think the member in his question talked about housing or Manitoba housing. That's not on this department's table. That's not anything I'm gonna be able to speak to. The Minister of Families is the one who's in charge of that portfolio, although we do assist with some of the major renovations and construction projects there. But in terms of the overall portfolio and its management, that's really within the Department of Families. And so from a housing perspective, not part of this of my responsibility in this department and not part of my response. The point that I think the member is talking about, say 3B on page 25 of the supplement to the estimates of expenditure, talks about a reduction of owned and leased portfolio. So my department's in charge of every office building that we own, the legislature, provincial office buildings in a variety of towns, the legislative buildings specifically, yeah. And all these buildings are in our purview as a department, and many of those buildings are owned. But there's also places where we lease. And I think the member probably can know, going up and down Broadway and in the vicinity here, you can see Manitoba government offices that are housed in buildings that aren't necessarily owned by the Manitoba government. And so what we're looking at here is primarily an opportunity to focus on the better utilization of the assets that we own. Sometimes that'll require a refresh or an investment in a particular asset. But overall, the goal there by investing in some of the buildings that we own is that we can reduce the number of buildings that we lease. And do a better job of using the assets that we own. And that's really what we're after with that measurement. The overall footprint that government uses, we want to make sure that we have enough room, but not that we're not paying with taxpayer money for room that we don't need. And that's in fact when we got into government and back in 2016, that's what we were finding is that sometimes leases were signed for convenience without a lot of creativity, and so you had government-owned buildings that were adequate or might have required relatively small investment to be made adequate, sitting empty while government money and taxpayer dollars really were being given to a private landlord just because the executive director of a particular division thought that they needed a bigger window. And so we don't want that, and we want to make sure that we're using our buildings prudently, that we're meeting standards for how much space an employee can have to work in, and all those other aspects that go in the management of a overall portfolio. But our goal is to use the assets that we have as well as possible.
The Honorable Member for St. James.
Thank you. I'd like to thank my colleague for giving me an opportunity to ask a couple questions here. I am going to ask some questions related to the rural broadband expansion project. Specifically, I'm hoping that the minister can provide an update on the status of work with ExploreNet. We know this contract falls under his department, and we know that recently, a couple of weeks ago, we learned that Manitoba Hydro let their employees know that work had stopped on that rural broadband expansion project. This seemed to be due to a disagreement between ExploreNet and Manitoba Hydro, and I'm hoping that the minister can provide some clarity on the status of that disagreement and when he suspects work will recommence.
The Honorable Minister.
I thank the member for the question, and I think maybe first start with setting the table here to ensure that that he knows that I share his desire to get every community, in fact, every household in Manitoba connected to high-speed broadband internet. That's my objective as a minister. That's what I want, and I think I want it for the very same reasons that the member wants it, because it's going to provide educational opportunities, especially for northern remote communities. It's going to provide employment opportunities. It's going to provide economic growth opportunities for our province. Certainly, very positive outcomes are already being seen, and more are being anticipated as we continue to connect communities. I do have an update for the member about the number of communities that are connected. I think when I had a brief opportunity in the House to read into the record some of the names of those communities. I promise I won't do that today. But back then there was I think it was 409, but it might have been 418 communities that we had on the list. The latest list of communities that have been connected has actually increased. Now it's up to 433 communities that have been connected. There's still a couple hundred more to do, and so we want to continue that. And I know First Nations in particular are concerned where we that's an area where we absolutely want to see those kind of opportunities for education, for employment, and for economic growth. That's gonna provide tremendous opportunities for First Nations and better outcomes for them. So we have 13 First Nations communities that have been already connected. There are 10 that are yet to be connected. So that's really the overall scope of where we're at. There's a contract in place. There's two parties at the table, Hydro and Explore. Certainly, I've indicated my desire that the dispute be resolved quickly, and I'm hopeful that that's what's going to happen.
The Honorable Member for St. James.
I appreciate the response. It's something that is hard to compute in terms of the information that's being offered by the minister and what we know to be the state of affairs with this contract between XploreNet and Manitoba Hydro. The minister is claiming that there have been over 400 communities that have been connected, and yet over the last 2 years, all we've heard from communities, from small Manitoba-based ISPs, small businesses, is that, first of all, there was a giant stop-sell order in place for approximately a year after the contract was first put in place. And now we're seeing a work stoppage, and that's due to dispute between XploreNet and Hydro in terms of XploreNet's concerns that Manitoba Hydro Telecom and Hydro are asking too significant a cost to connect to our fiber. So there seems to be a disconnect here, and I just really would like to have the minister on record clarify, because he's talked about these connections and he's read the list of communities. But we know that the province is separated into zones. And Zone 1, which is mostly covers southern Manitoba, which includes a lot of the towns and, that the minister read off in his list last week, is a zone that was given to Valley Fiber that has no bearing on the work that's being done by XploreNet. And that Valley Fiber work is being done through funding from the federal government, and they're, to my knowledge, and the minister can clarify if I'm wrong, they've received no funding from the province to support that expansion. So I'm hoping the minister can be clear on record when he's saying that these 400 plus connections are all happening in zones that are specifically committed to XploreNet. Can he on record tell us today that he is honestly referring to connections that have been completed through that relationship with XploreNet?
The Honorable Minister.
Yeah, I thank the member for his inquiry. He seems to want to get into a lot of particular details. Really, what I'm looking at here at this level is to say that we have an overall agreement with Explore, and Hydros is part of that agreement as well through the Manitoba government, and we want to we want to see that agreement completed. Now, the information that we get reported back is that 433 communities have been connected, and that is ahead of schedule. But in terms of dictating which communities are going to be hooked up when, and which are going to be nearer to the end of the agreement period, or which ones are going to be before or sooner in the agreement period, that's not something that my department puts its fingers into, as much as the member might want to do that.
The Honorable Member for the Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm giving a few minutes to member from Tyndall Park till 4:45.
Okay, we have an agreement that the member for Tyndall Park will have the floor till 4:45, at which point I will interrupt in order to proceed with the questions. The Honorable Member for Tyndall Park.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and I'd like to thank the Minister and all the departmental staff who are here this afternoon and trying to answer our questions to the best of their ability as well. And I'm going to try and condense my questions as much as possible, and whatever answers you can provide, I would greatly appreciate. Earlier in the pandemic, we had what was called visitation pods installed at some of the long-term care facilities. I was hoping that the Minister could share some insight into what will happen with the visitation shelters once decommissioned. If you could provide a bit of a breakdown as to how many will be donated, sold, or destroyed. Just any insight if Manitobans have expressed interest in the pods, or if the Minister is accepting ideas people might have about them.
The Honorable Minister.
Yeah, I thank the member, and I understand the member's time crunch, and the member knows how much I admire and respect her as a member of the opposition. She does a phenomenal job in the House and also here in this Committee of Supply. So I will endeavor to be quick in my responses. What I would say is that we're still in the evaluation stage of all the proposals that we've received. But I can say that there was proposals for donation. That's the vast majority of the proposals. About 80% of all the proposals we received was for donation. And there was enough proposals for donation to account for all of the units multiple times over. So this makes me optimistic that we'll be able to find a donation recipient for every pod. That's certainly my hope. Now, there were a few submissions for auction, I guess, where there was for more of a commercial use. It's possible, depending on the location and the nature of the request, that one of those might be selected, but we're still in that evaluation phase. I'm happy to report that we received absolutely zero proposals to dispose and scrap, and nobody wants that as the outcome either. Thanks.
The Honorable Member for Tyndall Park.
Can the Minister speak a little bit to the donations, what that might look like, how the pods are being intended to be used?
The Honorable Minister.
Yeah, I think the member, I understand, I think where she's going to, but really, because we have such a variety of proposals in front of us, I don't want to prejudice the evaluation process. I want that process to move forward in a good way. What I will say is that, you know, the proposals that I've seen, there's tremendous social good that can result from the appropriate allocation of these pods. And once the evaluation process is complete and the decisions are made, that information will become public as to where they're going to go and who's going to use them and how are they going to use them.
The Honorable Member for Tyndall Park.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you for your response to Minister. I'm going to move on to another subject, but just if you want to take a moment of your next answer, if you could elaborate a little bit on if there's a timeline at all for what to expect with the pods. My next question is about ICIP, the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program. Can you provide a breakdown of the funding in terms of where the projects came from, who applied for the projects, and the kinds of infrastructure projects approved and those not approved?
The Honorable Minister.
I'm sensitive to the time constraints here, and I don't think I can offer a particularly fulsome response to the member, but I will give what I can. So on the visitation pods, expect that decision to be made as to who, which organizations will receive the pods should be made this summer. I think the hope is that before the end of the calendar year, all of the pods will have been allocated and moved. What I can say on ISIP is that there's a total of $3.3 billion in total project costs, of which about 1.2 was funding that we received to support those. There's 138 projects that have been approved. I think 4 are still waiting review, as the last note that I have here. But our ISIP program has been fully expended, and the member can expect to see some news releases from time to time. There's probably already been quite a few of them made as well. Thanks.
The hour being 4:45, as previously agreed upon, we will now, we're finished with questions. We will now proceed to the considerations of the resolution. I will,
Yeah, don't you dare.
I will now call Resolution 8.2. Resolve that there be granted to His Majesty a sum not exceeding $329,553,000 for consumer protection and government services, capital programs for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2024. Shall the resolution pass? The resolution is accordingly passed. Resolution 8.3. Resolve that there be granted to His Majesty a sum not exceeding $55,084,000 for consumer protection and government services, digital and technology solutions for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2024. Shall the resolution pass?
Pass.
The resolution is accordingly passed. Resolution 8.4. Resolved that there be granted to His Majesty a sum not exceeding $18,910,000 for consumer protection and government services, procurement and supply chain for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2024. Shall the resolution pass?
Pass.
The resolution is accordingly passed. Resolution 8.5. Resolved that there be granted to His Majesty a sum not exceeding $22,393,000 for consumer protection and government services, public safety communication services for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2024. Shall the resolution pass?
Pass.
The resolution is accordingly passed. Resolution 8.6. Resolved that there be granted to His Majesty a sum not exceeding $17,059,000 for consumer protection and government services, consumer protection for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2024. Shall the resolution pass?
Pass.
The resolution is accordingly passed. There is no Resolution 8.7. Resolution 8.8. Resolved that there be granted to His Majesty a sum not exceeding $56,200,000 for consumer protection and government services, capital assets for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2024. Shall the resolution pass? The resolution is accordingly passed. Resolution 8.9. Resolved that there be granted to His Majesty a sum not exceeding $62,071,000 for consumer protection and government services, other reporting entities, capital investment for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2024. Shall the resolution pass? The resolution is accordingly passed. The last item to be considered for these estimates is item 1(a), the minister's salary contained in Resolution 8.1. The floor is now open for questions. The honorable member for Maples.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the line item 8.1 bracket A be amended so that the Minister of Consumer Protection and Government Services salary be reduced to $21,000.
Feels so good. Feels so good.
So that's the motion.
21.
It's
21.
been moved by the member for Maples.
It has been moved by the honorable member for the Maples that line item 8.1 brackets A be amended so the Minister of Consumer Protection and Government Services salary be reduced to $21,000. The motion is in order. Are there any questions or comments on this motion? Is the committee ready for the question? Shall the motion pass? I hear a no. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed to the motion, please say nay. Nay. In my opinion, the nays have it.
The motion is accordingly defeated.
The motion is accordingly defeated.
Resolution.
Resolution 8.1. Resolved that there be granted to His Majesty a sum not exceeding $1,813,000 for consumer protection and government services, corporate administration and planning for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2024. Shall the resolution pass? Pass. The resolution is accordingly passed. This completes the estimates of the Department of Consumer Protection and Government Services.
Two more departments.
Okay. Do you want your staff joining you or anything, or you just?
Do I want my staff, are you gonna ask me any questions about, we're just gonna roll? This is roll. Perfect.
No questions. I was nice and organised. Here we go. So we don't need that bit, so you can just do this and then carry on.
The next set of estimates to be considered by this section of the Committee of Supply are for the Department of Public Service Commission.
So start with them.
Does the Honorable Minister have an opening statement?
No.
Does the critic from the official opposition have an opening statement?
Floor is open for questions.
The floor is open for questions. No questions. We will now proceed to consideration of the resolutions. Resolution 17.1, resolved that there be granted to His Majesty a sum not exceeding $27,933,000 for Public Service Commission for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2024. Shall the resolution pass?
Pass.
The resolution is accordingly passed.
This completes.
This completes the estimates of the Department of Public Service Commission.
Next.
Yep.
One more.
Oh yeah.
The next set of estimates to be considered by this section of the Committee of Supply are for the Department of Employee Pensions and other costs. Does the Honorable Minister have an opening statement?
No.
Does the critic from the official opposition have an opening statement? The floor is now open for questions. Hearing no further questions, we will now proceed to consideration of the resolutions. I will now call Resolution 6.1. Resolved that there be granted to His Majesty a sum not exceeding $33,652,000 for employee pensions and other costs. Employee pensions and other costs for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2024. Shall the resolution pass?
Pass.
The resolution is accordingly passed.
Next page.
This completes the estimates of the Department of Employee Pensions and other costs. This also concludes our considerations of the estimates in this section of the Committee of Supply meeting in room 254. And we still have a couple minutes left, so I'd just like to thank everybody. Estimates are over. I've been chairing estimates for a number of years, and it looks like this may be my last day chairing estimates. So I'd like to thank everybody for taking part. There have been times over the years when estimates got a little bit out of control, but we're able to live through it. I'd like to thank all the staff because they've done a great job, especially my partner, Tim here. He's been with me for a lot of years, and thank you very much for guiding me, Tim. I mean, in other different departments and different committees, all the staff has been great. So I just want to thank you guys today, and you guys. It's great to have people that you can work with. Thank you.
Good job.
Do it one more time.
Oh, committee rise.
Give it a good gavel.
Give it a, hey.